"Drop the weapon! I said drop it now!" The scream tore through the freezing midnight air, echoing off the flickering neon signs of the Chevron station. "Officer, wait! He's not the—" A woman's voice begged, cut short by the deafening crack of a 9mm. Blood bloomed across the chest of a man whose hands were already raised in surrender. Officer Caleb Martin lowered his smoking barrel, his heart hammering with adrenaline and unjustified pride. He thought he'd just taken down a thug. He was dead wrong. He just shot an Army Ranger. The rain was falling in absolute sheets, hammering against the windshield of Jordan Hayes' beaten-up Ford F-150. It was past 2 a.m, and the lonely stretch of Interstate 95 running through South Carolina was slick with oil and black water. Jordan gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the hypnotic, rhythmic swipe of the wiper blades. He was exhausted. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion that only came from days of travel and years of carrying heavy burdens. Jordan was a former operator with the 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment out of Fort Moore. He was used to the dark, used to the cold, and used to pushing his body past the breaking point. But tonight, all he wanted was a cup of black coffee and to make it home to his 6-year-old daughter's birthday party by sunrise. Up ahead, the glowing halo of a Chevron gas station cut through the torrential downpour. It was an oasis in a desert of asphalt. Jordan flicked his blinker, the rhythmic clicking a harsh contrast to the roar of the rain, and pulled under the brightly lit canopy. The station looked mostly deserted, save for a rusted sedan idling near the air pump. Jordan killed the engine, zipped up his faded olive-drab jacket to hide the legally concealed Glock 19 resting in his waistband, and stepped out into the biting wind. Inside the store, the fluorescent lights buzzed with a sick yellow intensity. The smell of stale coffee, cheap floor wax, and synthetic cherry air freshener assaulted his senses. A young clerk, no older than 19, was standing behind the register, looking incredibly nervous. Jordan nodded at her, making his way toward the back coolers. He didn't notice the erratic twitching of the man standing by the snack aisle until it was almost too late. The man was strung out, drenched in sweat despite the freezing temperature outside. His eyes were wide, darting frantically around the small space. As Jordan reached for a bottle of water, the man suddenly lunged toward the counter, pulling a cheap silver revolver from his baggy sweatpants. "Open the register! Open it now, or I swear to God I'll blow your head off!" the addict screamed, slamming the barrel of the gun against the plexiglass barrier. The young clerk shrieked, dropping her hands to her head, paralyzed by sheer terror. Jordan's training kicked in instantly. The world around him slowed down to a crawl. The buzzing of the lights, the screaming of the robber, the drumming of the rain on the roof. It all faded into a singular, hyper-focused tunnel of situational awareness. He didn't panic. He didn't shout. He moved with the silent, lethal grace of a predator. He closed the distance in 3 massive strides. Before the robber could even register the movement behind him, Jordan clamped his left hand down on the cylinder of the revolver, preventing it from rotating and firing. Simultaneously, his right arm snaked around the man's throat in a textbook rear naked choke. With a sharp twist, Jordan disarmed the man, tossing the silver revolver sliding across the linoleum floor, far out of reach. The robber thrashed for barely 3 seconds before Jordan swept his legs, pinning him to the ground with a knee securely planted in the center of his spine. "Call 911, Jordan told the clerk, his voice eerily calm, smooth as glass. "Tell them the situation is under control. Suspect is restrained." But destiny, it seemed, had a cruel sense of irony. Outside, the wail of sirens pierced the storm. Officer Caleb Martin had been parked barely 2 blocks away, nursing a bitter resentment about being passed over for sergeant for the 3rd time. Caleb was a man driven by ego, a cop who viewed the badge not as a shield for the innocent, but as a hammer for his own authority. He had a reputation in the department, too quick to draw, too eager to escalate, and entirely too willing to bend the truth to justify his aggression. Caleb slammed his cruiser into the Chevron parking lot, drawing his service weapon before his boots even hit the wet pavement. He kicked the glass door open, his eyes scanning the scene. He saw a large man in a military jacket standing over a body on the floor, holding a weapon. It wasn't the robber's gun. It was Jordan's own concealed carry, which he had drawn to clear the room but was now holding by the barrel, pointed at the floor in a completely non-threatening posture. "Drop the weapon, I said! Drop it now!" Caleb screamed, his finger twitching nervously on the trigger. Jordan slowly turned his head. He recognized the panicked, adrenaline-fueled look in the officer's eyes, the look of an untrained man about to make a fatal mistake. Jordan immediately opened his hands, letting his pistol clatter harmlessly onto the counter next to him. He raised both hands in the air, palms facing forward. "Officer, I am the good guy. The suspect is on the floor. I'm unarmed." "Officer, wait! He's not the—" the clerk begged from behind the register. Caleb didn't listen. He didn't assess. Driven by a toxic cocktail of fear and an arrogant desire to be the hero of the night, he saw a perceived threat and reacted. Crack! The gunshot was deafening in the confined space. Jordan felt a sledgehammer slam into his chest. The force lifted him slightly off his feet before gravity dragged him down. He hit the cold floor hard, the fluorescent light spinning wildly above him. As darkness crept in at the edges of his vision, Jordan's last conscious thought wasn't of anger, but of profound sadness. He wasn't going to make it to his daughter's birthday. The silence that followed the gunshot was absolute and terrifying, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of a spilled coffee cup on the counter. Jordan Hayes lay motionless, a dark pool of crimson expanding rapidly across the cheap linoleum. Behind the counter, the young clerk, Maria, let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. Her hands clamped over her mouth in sheer horror. Officer Caleb Martin stood frozen for exactly 5 seconds. His breathing was ragged, his ears ringing from the discharge of his weapon in the enclosed space. He looked at the smoking barrel of his Glock, then down at the man bleeding out on the floor. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving behind a cold, sickening realization. The man on the ground had his hands empty. His weapon was sitting harmlessly on the counter. Panic, pure and unadulterated, seized Caleb's chest. He knew his record. He had 2 prior excessive force complaints in his file, one for breaking a teenager's jaw during a traffic stop, another for deploying a taser on a pregnant woman. The union had buried both, but the chief had warned him. One more slip-up, and he was gone. This wasn't a slip-up. This was an unprovoked shooting of an unarmed man who had just stopped a robbery. This was prison. Caleb's survival instinct, the darkest, most self-serving part of his nature, took over. He holstered his weapon and took a step toward Jordan. The man's chest was rising and falling in shallow, desperate jerks. He was alive, but barely. "Hey! Hey, look at me!" Caleb barked at the clerk, his voice trembling with a forced, aggressive edge. Maria flinched, terrified. "He raised the gun at me. You saw that, right? He pointed it right at me." No," Maria stammered, tears streaming down her face. "He saved me. He put his gun down. His hands were up." "Shut up!" Caleb roared, his face flushing dark red. "You're in shock. You didn't see it right. He was aggressive." Caleb looked down at the floor. The robber, still pinned by the pain in his back, was groaning, entirely useless as a witness. Caleb's eyes darted to Jordan's gun resting on the counter. It was too far away to claim Jordan was reaching for it. Caleb stepped over Jordan's bleeding body. He reached out, his hand shaking, and grabbed Jordan's Glock by the grip. He carefully, deliberately, kicked the silver revolver the robber had used under a shelf out of sight. Then, wiping the handle of Jordan's gun on his own pants to smear the prints, he dropped it directly next to Jordan's outstretched, limp right hand. It was a textbook frame job, sloppy, desperate, but in the chaos of a crime scene it might just be enough. Only then did Caleb key his shoulder mic. Shots fired at the interstate chevron. Suspect is down. I need a bus rolling hot right now." Within minutes, the wail of approaching sirens shattered the night. Red and blue lights strobed through the rain, casting nightmarish shadows across the gas station walls. 2 backup cruisers skidded to a halt. Officers burst through the doors, weapons drawn. "Clear!" Caleb shouted, playing the part of the seasoned veteran who had just survived a life-or-death encounter. He was kneeling next to Jordan now, pressing a half-hearted wad of paper towels against the gunshot wound, making sure his colleagues saw him trying to save the man he had just tried to murder. "Talk to me, Martin. What happened?" Sergeant Brody asked, his eyes sweeping the room, taking in the cowering clerk and the bleeding man. "Walked into an armed robbery in progress," Caleb lied, his voice remarkably steady now that the narrative was forming in his head. "The suspect on the floor," he pointed at the groaning addict, "was down. But this guy," he pointed at Jordan, "he turned on me, had a weapon in his hand, refused commands to drop it. He raised it, Sarge. I had no choice. It was him or me." Brody looked down at the Glock lying inches from Jordan's fingers. It looked perfectly plausible. "All right, secure the scene." Get the paramedics in here now. As the EMTs rushed in, tearing open Jordan's jacket to apply a chest seal, Brody turned to Caleb. "Your body cam on, Martin." Caleb feigned a look of sudden realization. He reached up and tapped the small black box on his chest. He had pressed the power button the second he realized he had messed up. "Damn it," Caleb muttered, his face a mask of perfect frustration. "Battery must have died or it malfunctioned in the scuffle. It's completely dead." Brody sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Internal Affairs is going to roast you over the fire for that, Caleb. You know the protocol." I know, Caleb said, looking appropriately remorseful. "But I'm telling you, Sarge, it was a clean shoot. The guy gave me no choice." As they loaded Jordan's lifeless body onto a stretcher, rolling him out into the pouring rain, Caleb watched from the doorway. He felt a twisted sense of triumph. He had controlled the narrative. The Clark was just a scared kid. Her testimony would be written off as trauma-induced confusion. The camera was off. The gun was planted. Caleb Martin thought he had buried his mistake. He didn't know that the man bleeding out in the back of the ambulance wasn't just some random citizen. He didn't know he had just awakened a sleeping giant. The trauma bay at St. Jude's Memorial Hospital was a chaotic symphony of shouting doctors, tearing plastic, and the frantic, high-pitched shrieking of a heart monitor. Jordan Hayes was dying. The 9mm hollow point had shattered his third rib, missed his heart by a miraculous fraction of an inch, but punctured his left lung and severed a minor artery before lodging near his spine. "Pressure is dropping! 70/40! A nurse yelled, her gloves slick with his blood. "Push 2 units of O negative right now. Get the chest tube in," the trauma surgeon ordered, his hands moving with desperate precision. Deep inside his subconscious, Jordan was no longer in South Carolina. He was thousands of miles away, back in the jagged, sun-baked mountains of the Korangal Valley in Afghanistan. He could smell the cordite in the air, feel the searing heat of the sun on his tactical helmet. The Taliban ambush had been devastating. His striker vehicle was hit by an IED engulfed in roaring flames. In his mind, he was back in the fire, grabbing his squad mates by the straps of their plate carriers, dragging them out of the burning wreckage while enemy fire chipped the rocks around his head. He remembered the pain, the screaming, the absolute refusal to let his brothers die. "Fight!" a voice whispered in the dark corners of his fading mind. "You didn't survive the valley to die on a dirty gas station floor. Fight!" On the operating table, Jordan's heart monitor flatlined. A long, continuous drone filled the room. "We're losing him! Charge paddles to 200! The electric shock jolted his massive frame off the table. "Nothing. Charge to 300! Clear!" Thump. A pause. Then a slow, ragged, rhythmic blip returned to the screen. Jordan Hayes, against all medical odds, clung to life by his fingernails. While Jordan fought for his life in surgery, Caleb Martin was sitting in the precinct break room, sipping a lukewarm coffee. He was on paid administrative leave, standard protocol for an officer-involved shooting. For Caleb, it was essentially a paid vacation. He was regaling a couple of younger, impressionable rookies with a heavily embellished version of the night's events. "Look, you don't have time to think," Caleb bragged, leaning back in his chair. "The guy squares up, weapon in hand, you gotta put him down. It's training, it's instinct. The city should be thanking me. I took an armed maniac off the streets." Across town, Detective Miller, a 20-year veteran with sharp eyes and a bullshit detector that never failed, was going through the personal effects pulled from Jordan's blood-soaked clothing at the hospital. He opened Jordan's worn leather wallet to look for an ID. He found a South Carolina driver's license, but behind it, tucked carefully away, he found something else. A military ID card. Miller frowned, pulling it out. Hayes, Jordan, rank, Sergeant First Class. Branch, U.S. Army. Miller kept digging. He found a small, folded piece of laminated paper. It was a medical alert card listing allergies, but the back was what caught Miller's eye. It was a list of emergency contacts, and at the very top, printed in bold letters, was a number for the Department of Veterans Affairs, followed by a specific notation. VHA Priority Group 1, Medal of Honor / Silver Star recipient. Miller's blood ran cold. He quickly moved to his computer, typing Jordan's name and military information into a federal database accessible to local law enforcement. When the file loaded, the detective sat back in his chair, the color draining from his face. The screen was filled with commendations. Jordan Hayes wasn't a thug, he was a Tier 1 operator. He had served 4 combat tours. He had been awarded the Purple Heart, the Bronze Star with Valor, and the Silver Star, the 3rd highest military decoration for valor in combat, for saving the lives of 3 men during a catastrophic ambush in Afghanistan. Miller grabbed his phone and dialed the Chief of Police. "Chief, it's Miller. We have a massive problem regarding the shooting at the Chevron. Martin didn't shoot a gangbanger." "Who did he shoot, Detective?" the chief asked, his voice tight. "He shot a decorated Army Ranger, a Silver Star recipient. And, Chief, I just watched the interview with the clerk from the gas station. She's hysterical, but she's adamant. She says Hayes was the one who stopped the robbery. She says he surrendered, put his gun down, and Martin shot him anyway." Silence hung on the line. The chief knew Caleb Martin's history. He knew this was a powder keg sitting next to a match. "Lock down the evidence," the chief finally ordered. "Do not let Martin near the file. Get the State Bureau of Investigation on the line. If Martin is lying, the fallout from this will destroy this department." Back in the break room, Caleb was laughing at a joke, oblivious to the fact that his carefully constructed lie was already beginning to fracture. He thought he was untouchable. He had no idea that by shooting Jordan Hayes, he hadn't just angered a man. He had awakened an entire brotherhood. News travels fast. In the tight-knit community of United States Army Rangers, it moves like a wildfire. By noon the next day, Jordan's condition had stabilized from critical to critical, but stable. He was in a medically induced coma in the intensive care unit, a spiderweb of tubes keeping him alive. Outside his hospital room, the atmosphere had dramatically shifted. It was no longer just nurses and doctors walking the halls. 2 massive men with close-cropped hair, thick beards, and wearing dark tactical clothing without insignia stood silently flanking Jordan's door. They didn't speak, they didn't move, they simply stood there, their eyes tracking everyone who walked past. They were former members of the 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, Jordan's brothers. And they weren't the only ones. Down in the hospital lobby, a quiet but imposing crowd of veterans had begun to gather. There were no protest signs, no chanting, no disruption. Just a stoic, physical presence of men and women who had bled for their country, standing in silent solidarity for a man who had sacrificed everything, only to be gunned down in his own hometown by a reckless cop. The pressure on the local police department became astronomical. The local news stations had gotten hold of the story. The headline wasn't "Police Shoot Armed Suspect." It was "Local Police Gun Down Decorated Army Hero Stopping a Robbery." Inside the precinct, the air was thick with tension. Caleb Martin had been called into the captain's office. The smug, confident demeanour he had worn the day before had vanished, replaced by a twitchy, defensive paranoia. "You told me it was a clean shoot, Martin," Captain Reynolds said, his voice dangerously low. He slid a folder across the desk. "You told me he raised a weapon. The clerk says differently." "She's a confused kid," Caleb snapped, pacing the room. "She was traumatized. I know what I saw. He had the gun. He brought it up. I fired. It's my word against a panicked teenager." "And the suspect?" "The addict. He was face down. He didn't see anything. I'm telling you, it's a clean shoot." Caleb lied through his teeth, but his stomach was churning. "The FBI has requested his file, Caleb," Reynolds said coldly. "The local Ranger Association has lawyers looking into this. You didn't just shoot a guy, Martin. You shot a beloved community figure who has friends in very high places. If you are lying to me, God help you." Caleb walked out of the office, his palms sweating. He needed to make sure his story was bulletproof. He had checked the cameras at the Chevron himself. He knew the main DVR under the counter had been fried by a power surge weeks ago. The owner had complained about it. There was no video. It was just his word against a terrified clerk. He could win that. He had to win that. But Caleb was a predator who had spent too long hunting sheep. He didn't know how to defend himself against wolves. Later that evening, a black Suburban pulled up to the precinct. 2 men in sharp, tailored suits stepped out. They weren't local PD. They were special agents with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Civil Rights Division, brought in specifically because of the high-profile nature of the victim. They walked straight into the evidence room. They didn't just look at the gun. They looked at the angles. They looked at the blood spatter reports. They interviewed the EMTs. "Notice the blood pooling, Agent Vance?" the senior agent asked, pointing to the crime scene photos. The victim fell backward, but the gun is resting perfectly beside his right hand, completely clear of the blood spatter. If he was holding it when he was shot, it would have dropped into the blood or been kicked away in the fall. This weapon was placed here after the fact. Staged, Agent Vance agreed, his eyes narrowing. Officer Martin turned off his body cam. He claimed the store camera was busted. It's a classic cover-up. We need proof, the senior agent said. A staged gun isn't enough to convict a cop in this state. We need to prove he fired without cause. What they didn't know, and what Caleb Martin didn't know, was that Elias, the paranoid 65-year-old owner of the Chevron station, didn't trust the local police. He didn't trust anyone. And a year ago, after being robbed for the third time, he had installed a secret insurance policy. Elias was a man who lived in the shadows of his own anxiety. When the police had swept the gas station on the night of the shooting, Caleb Martin had smugly noted the dead DVR unit under the counter. He thought he was clear. But Elias, sitting in his cramped, cluttered office behind the storeroom 3 days later, was staring at a laptop screen with trembling hands. Elias didn't just have the obvious dome cameras on the ceiling, he had a tiny pinhole camera, a high-definition lens no bigger than a dime, hidden perfectly inside the metal grating of the air conditioning vent directly above the cash register. It didn't record to a physical hard drive, it uploaded constantly, quietly to a secure cloud server. Elias clicked the mouse, scrubbing back through the timeline to the night of the storm. The footage loaded. It was pristine, crystal clear, 1080p resolution with audio. Elias watched the robbery unfold. He saw Jordan Hayes move with terrifying speed, disarming the addict and pinning him down. Then he saw Officer Caleb Martin burst through the doors. Elias's breath hitched in his throat. The angle from the vent was perfect. It looked down on Jordan from a slight angle. The video showed Jordan clearly turning his head. It showed Jordan's hand opening, placing his Glock onto the counter, far away from his body. It showed Jordan raising both empty hands high into the air, palms open. Elias heard the audio perfectly. "Officer, I am the good guy. The suspect is on the floor. I'm unarmed." And then, without a single warning, without any hesitation or threat assessment, Elias watched Officer Caleb Martin raise his weapon and fire a bullet directly into Jordan's chest. The video didn't stop there. Elias watched in sickened horror as Caleb panicked. He watched the officer deliberately kick the robber's gun away. He watched Caleb take Jordan's gun from the counter, wipe the grip on his uniform pants, and drop it carefully next to Jordan's bleeding hand. He watched Caleb reach up and manually turn off his body camera. It was premeditated, calculated, cold-blooded attempted murder and evidence tampering caught in unblinking, high-definition truth. Elias was terrified. He knew Caleb Martin's reputation. If he gave this to the local police, there was a chance it would disappear. Cops protected cops. Elias didn't know who to trust, but he had seen the news. He saw the men standing outside the hospital. He knew Jordan Hayes was a man of honor. Elias didn't call the police. He found the contact information for the attorney representing the Ranger Association, a ruthless former military prosecutor named Sarah Jenkins. Elias sent her an encrypted email with a single link and a password. Subject: The truth about the Chevron. Sarah Jenkins opened the link in her downtown office. As the video played, her jaw tightened. The anger that boiled up inside her was icy and sharp. She had dealt with corrupt cops before, but the brazen arrogance of Caleb Martin's actions was staggering. He had shot a hero and tried to frame him like a common criminal. She didn't take the video to the local precinct. She bypassed the city entirely. Sarah Jenkins took the flash drive directly to the United States Attorney's Office and the FBI field office. The trap was set. Caleb Martin was walking around the city, drinking free coffees, accepting pats on the back from officers who believed his lie. He was blissfully unaware that the ground beneath his feet had completely eroded, and the fall was going to be spectacular. The karma Caleb had dodged for years, the pain he had inflicted on the innocent with his badge as a shield, had finally circled back. And it was coming for him with the unstoppable force of a freight train. The arrest happened not in a quiet alley, but in the middle of the precinct bullpen. It was a Tuesday morning. Caleb was officially coming off administrative leave, swaggering into the station in his pressed uniform, ready to get back on patrol. He poured himself a coffee, joking loudly with the desk sergeant. The heavy glass doors of the precinct swung open. 6 federal agents in dark windbreakers with FBI emblazoned in yellow letters strode into the room, flanked by 2 state investigators. The bullpen fell dead silent. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioner. Special Agent Vance walked straight up to Caleb. "Caleb Martin," Caleb smirked, though his eyes darted nervously. "Yeah, what can I do for the feds?" "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Vance said, his voice carrying through the silent room. "Excuse me," Caleb scoffed, taking a step back. "On what charge?" "Attempted murder in the first degree, deprivation of rights under colour of law, tampering with evidence, falsifying a police report." Vance didn't blink. He grabbed Caleb's wrist, twisted it painfully behind his back, and slammed cold steel handcuffs shut. The metallic click-click echoed like a gunshot. Hey, you can't do this! I'm a cop!" Caleb shouted, struggling vainly as they stripped his badge and service weapon from his belt, right there in front of his peers. The other officers, men who had defended him yesterday, just stood and watched, their faces grim. "Not anymore, Martin," Captain Reynolds said, stepping out of his office. He looked at Caleb with absolute disgust. "You make us all look like monsters." 6 months later, the courtroom was packed to capacity. The air was thick with tension. On one side of the aisle sat a sea of blue uniforms, police officers who were deeply divided. On the other side sat a wall of men and women in civilian clothes, but holding themselves with military bearing. The Rangers had shown up. At the prosecutor's table sat Jordan Hayes. He was in a wheelchair, his left leg paralysed from nerve damage caused by the bullet, but his posture was perfectly straight. He wore his dress uniform, the silver star gleaming brightly on his chest. He looked at Caleb Martin not with anger but with a cold, piercing judgment. Caleb sat at the defence table, his arrogant swagger entirely gone. He looked pale, gaunt, and terrified. His high-priced defence attorney had tried every trick in the book, trying to suppress the video, claiming illegal wiretapping, attempting to discredit the gas station owner. The judge had thrown every motion out. The prosecutor, Sarah Jenkins, stood before the jury. She didn't need a flashy opening statement. She simply dimmed the lights and turned on the projector. The hidden camera footage from the Chevron vent played on a massive screen for the entire courtroom to see. The jury watched in stunned, horrifying silence as Jordan saved the clerk, surrendered completely, and was gunned down in cold blood. The gasps in the courtroom were audible when the video showed Caleb wiping his fingerprints off Jordan's gun and planting it. When the lights came up, Caleb's defense attorney put his head in his hands. There was no defense. Jordan took the stand. He spoke softly, clearly, without malice. He recounted the events not as a victim, but as a soldier giving an after-action report. "Why didn't you defend yourself against the officer, Sergeant Hayes?" the defense attorney asked, a desperate final attempt to find a flaw. Jordan looked directly at Caleb. "Because I swore an oath to protect the people of this country, even the ones wearing a badge who have forgotten what honor means. I will not fire on an American police officer. I relied on his training. Unfortunately, he had none." The verdict took the jury less than 45 minutes. Guilty on all counts. The judge, an older woman with no tolerance for corruption, looked down at Caleb from the bench. "Caleb Martin, you were given a badge to protect the vulnerable. Instead, you acted as an executioner, driven by cowardice and ego. You shot a man who has done more for this country in one day than you have in your entire miserable life. And then you tried to destroy his honor to save your own skin." The judge struck the gavel. "I sentence you to 45 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. May God have mercy on you, because this court has none." The iron doors of the United States Penitentiary, Atlanta, slammed shut with a deafening, final boom. It was a sound that shook Caleb Martin to his very core. He was stripped of his name, given a number, and issued a scratchy, ill-fitting orange jumpsuit. Caleb had spent his entire career putting men in cages, using intimidation and force to assert dominance. Now he was the prey. He was a disgraced ex-cop entering federal prison, the absolute bottom of the food chain. The warden, a hard-eyed man who had served in the Marines, read Caleb's file in his office before assigning him a cell. He saw the details of the crime. He saw who Caleb had shot. "Put him in Block C," the warden ordered the head guard. "Block C, sir?" the guard asked, raising an eyebrow. "That block has a heavy veteran population. They've all seen the news. They know who he is and what he did to that ranger." "I know," the warden replied coldly. "Just ensure he isn't physically harmed. Let the psychological weight handle the rest." Caleb was marched down the long, concrete corridor of cell block C. As he walked past the steel bars, the usual chaotic noise of the prison slowly died down. It was replaced by something much worse, complete, utter, freezing silence. Men stood at their cell doors watching him. Many of them bore military tattoos. They didn't shout insults. They didn't threaten him. They just stared at him with absolute, unadulterated contempt. Caleb was placed in a single cell at the end of the block. For the first few weeks, Caleb lived in constant terror of a physical attack. But the attack never came. The veterans in the prison had a code. Caleb wasn't worth dirtying their hands. Instead, they administered a punishment far worse than a beating. Total, crushing isolation. When Caleb sat at a table in the mess hall, everyone else stood up and walked away. When he entered the recreation yard, a massive circle of empty space formed around him. No one spoke to him. The guards, many of whom were also former military, looked straight through him as if he didn't exist. He was a ghost, trapped in a concrete tomb of his own making. In the silence of his cell late at night, the karma finally broke him. Caleb was left alone with his thoughts, stripped of his badge, his gun, and his false bravado. He realized that he was fundamentally weak. He had shot a man who had his hands up because he was terrified. He was a coward who had hidden behind authority, and now the universe had stripped that authority away, leaving him naked to face the truth of what he was. He spent his nights staring at the cinder-block ceiling. The image of Jordan Hayes standing tall in the courtroom burned into his retinas. Caleb wept, not for the man he shot, but for his own miserable, wasted life. Meanwhile, 3 years later, miles away in a sunny park in Georgia, Jordan Hayes walked slowly with the aid of a carbon fiber cane. He had a slight limp, a permanent reminder of the betrayal at the Chevron station, but his eyes were bright. He was pushing his daughter on a swing, her laughter ringing out clear and joyful in the crisp autumn air. Jordan had been medically retired from the army, but he had found a new purpose. He was working as a tactical de-escalation instructor for police academies across the state, teaching young cadets how to handle fear, how to read a room, and how to value human life over ego. He had taken the worst moment of his life, a moment of profound injustice, and turned it into a mission to ensure no one else would suffer at the hands of a coward with a badge. Jordan Hayes had survived the fire of war and the fire of betrayal. He was still standing. Caleb Martin would die in a concrete box, forgotten and despised. Jordan Hayes was living, loved, and revered. Karma, it turned out, wasn't just a force of vengeance. It was the ultimate scale of justice, balancing the cowardice of the wicked against the unyielding strength of the righteous. If this story of truth, honor, and ultimate justice kept you on the edge of your seat, you know what to do next. Hit that like button to show your respect for the real heroes out there who put their lives on the line every single day. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and family so they can experience this intense journey of karma hitting back harder than ever. We release gripping, real-life drama stories just like this one every single week. So make sure you smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss our next epic tale. Have you ever witnessed a moment where karma caught up with someone instantly? Let us know down in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next incredible video.